everybody. My name is Dr. Peter Keegan. I'm a lecturer at the University of Auckland in the Faculty of Education. I am a member of the Maori ethnic group of New Zealand, and in this session I'm talking about minority perspectives on education. One of the interesting things about many classrooms and many schools in modern contexts is that our classrooms have now become very diverse in terms of the number of cultures and the number of languages that students speak. And this has happened because of a number of reasons. The main reason is because of migration, in the sense that in many of our major cities there has been a migration of people from rural communities, and those people are often minority or indigenous people that have moved to the cities in order to look for work, in order to look for educational opportunities, and sometimes just for change. And it's likely that this increasing diversity is going to be a feature of classrooms in the near future. And the fact that we've got changes in our schools, changes in our classrooms, certainly has implications for assessments. And what we'll be doing in the rest of this session is thinking about and talking about what sort of perspectives minorities might have on assessment and how might they be different from the majority populations. When we think about the minorities that are now present in many of our classrooms, we are often encountered with some very, very different groups of people. I've mentioned before that minorities might have migrated from within a country. They may have come from somewhere outside of our country. They may be an indigenous group, or they may be a group that comes from countries that are very much nearby. For example, in New Zealand, we now have a large, significant population of people from our nearby Pacific countries. Some of our migrants living in New Zealand have been in New Zealand for many generations. In other cases, they've only recently arrived. In many cases, migrants to places like New Zealand, Australia and elsewhere have voluntarily decided to shift there. In other cases, migrants have arrived due to having to leave the normal countries of residence. In addition to having minority groups based on different cultures, different languages, sometimes different religious beliefs, minorities may also be stigmatized in terms of individual differences based on things like disability, sexual orientation, or other factors. So minorities can vary in a number of different ways. They may speak the language of the majority of the population. In a case like New Zealand, it's English. Or they may speak language or other languages other than English. They may write those languages that they know, or it may be just a spoken language. They may belong to different religions, despite speaking the same language and seemingly having very similar cultural practices. Within a particular group there might be a variety of different cultural practices. Some of our ethnic communities also may be multi-ethnic, may be multicultural. They may come from a place where there's a variety of different cultures, a variety of different languages spoken. Also, ethnic groups may be distinguished in terms of social class or social hierarchies, and that may restrict the association of members within that group. And it's not always often apparent to outsiders how in fact minority groups actually are constituted or how they in fact are structured. And the other thing we need to be conscious of when it comes to minority groups is often very different perspectives on how well or to what extent the community wishes to integrate or become a part of the majority culture. In some cases, we may have a community, we may have groups or even individuals that identify with the majority culture in a very positive way, want to speak the majority language, want to be involved in the majority culture as much as possible, often to the detriment of their own language and their own culture. In other cases, we have minority groups. They want to participate in the majority culture, they want to learn the majority language. In a case like New Zealand, that's English, yet they still want to retain their own culture and in some cases their own languages within the existing school system. In other cases, we have ethnic groups that wish to engage with the majority culture but wish to limit their own cultural practices to home and within their own community settings. And in those cases, those particular individuals or groups may not wish to be distinguished in our school and classroom settings. At other circumstances, we may have minority groups or Indigenous groups that wish to retain their own languages and their own cultural practices within the mainstream or the government-funded education system. For example, for Māori in New Zealand, it is possible for Māori to be educated in the medium of Māori, learn to a curriculum that is only written in the Māori language, to pretty much have Māori teachers that are very much conversant with the Māori community and practices. And because those students are English-speaking, New Zealand is an English-speaking place, there is also a time and a place for use of a language like English. So there's a wide variety of perspectives on how minorities may wish to integrate into a mainstream or a majority culture. When it comes to perspectives on assessment, we often may encounter some different perspectives on how minorities wish to be assessed. Do they wish to be assessed along with the majority students, considered a majority students, no particular difference being made? Do they wish assessment practice to acknowledge that they come from a particular cultural group? They may not use English as their first language, or a minority group may wish to have greater control over assessment practices, right to the extent that the minority group may wish to have assessment tools in their own language that have been developed by their own teachers, standardised within their own students and trialled amongst their own populations. The development of assessment tools for a particular group assumes that we have reasonable numbers of those minority students and also the expertise in order to undertake those practices. For example, an example of one particular minority group wishing to have greater control over assessment tools and practices is the group of the Indigenous people of New Zealand, the Māori community. The majority of Māori students are in English medium classrooms, learning in the medium of English. That's around about 85% of Māori students. There is, however, a small percentage of students that are learning in the medium of Māori. In New Zealand, there is no restriction on who enters Māori medium education. It's up to parents to choose on which form of education they enrol their students. You don't have to be of Māori descent or belong to the Māori ethnic group to enrol in Māori medium education. And in all Māori medium schools and classrooms you will find students of non-Māori descent. But what the New Zealand government has done is it's sponsored the development of assessment tools that are in the medium of Māori, that have been developed by Māori teachers, Māori curriculum experts, trialled amongst the Māori student population, national norms created that look at the how we can compare individual students, groups of students compared to the national Māori norms, and those tools are greatly used by Māori teachers. It's important to note that these tools aren't simply a translation of their English equivalents. They have been developed, trialled by Māori teachers, and okayed and checked by Māori teachers as being suitable for Māori students learning through the medium of Māori. There are other issues that we need to consider when it comes to the assessment of minority students. When we are assessing minority students in mainstream cultures, in the case of New Zealand, those learning through the medium of English, we need to take into account issues such as bias, fairness and sensitivity when it comes to our minority populations. In the case of New Zealand, we have three major minority groups. We have the Māori community, around about 14% of the total population, the Pacifica community from islands throughout the Pacific, in particular Samoa, Fiji, Tonga, Niue, the Cook Islands, Rarotonga and other countries, and also we have in recent times a sizable number of Asian students. And one of the things that the New Zealand government does provides some assessment tools that provide norms for each of these major ethnic groups, and also it provides norms for those whose English isn't a first language. For those of us that belong to a minority community, it's worthwhile thinking about our own experiences of the school system. Were there appropriate assessment tools and procedures provided for when we were students? Did the assessment practices take into account the wishes of our own communities? For those of us that are currently teaching minority students, do we have appropriate assessment tools? Do we have appropriate assessment procedures that are suitable for our minority students? And do those procedures meet the wishes of minority students? Thank you.